Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, and in my previous quest to bring you a character that still is a lot of fun, still does a lot of damage, but is a lot tankier, I did eventually make Beeftain the First. Beeftain the First was, well, it's a chieftain that uses Blade Vortex, pure fire, non-crit, pretty easy to build, very strong overall, and at this point has been played by a lot of people, so it's time to find Beeftain the Second, and we tried that in the previous league, maybe once or twice, and potentially we've found Beeftain the Second in the form of this Mjolnir character that is a chieftain using Mjolnir, using Wave of Conviction, Purifying Flame in channeling, with a cast while channeling setup on charge dash, and I've also tried to jam in the new divinity chest, which is called Garb of the Ephemeral. Now, that one I'm not sure I could ever recommend to you, but I will go over it and you will see bits of gameplay where I am going Super Saiyan Divine. So it may well be the first and only time you see someone using this chest, and I think I've put it to somewhat of a decent use. The problem is it's just kind of not that worth building around, and I'll probably go into that when I actually start describing the character in game. But for now, just watch a few clips of how the character plays out, and every time I go big golden and have a 10-second buff called Divinity, well, that's the chest itself going to work, and it just gives you a bunch more damage while it's up, but it's only up half the time. So I will go over it a bit more quite a bit later in the video, but for the most part, just want you guys to see the gameplay, what's going on here, because this has turned out to be quite a beefy character. By now it's something like level 88. It's got very smooth leveling, and the premise of the character is to have Wave of Conviction put into your Mjolnir. So typically you can only have lightning spells triggered from your Mjolnir mace, and that is pretty obvious lightning stuff. But Wave of Conviction is a new skill that is both lightning and fire based, and it's based off of fizz. So you can put that into your mace and trigger Wave of Conviction every single time your Mjolnir hits something based off the internal cooldown, and then you are now based off of physical, and that means you can start doing some more funky interactions with Mjolnir, like something like this chieftain, because the chieftain converts half of your fizz into fire. I then have something like 85%, I think, maybe more, fire damage converted from our physical, and we're a fizz-based character with a very strong skill that then does a lot of additional fire damage with extra % fire modifiers, something that a traditional Mjolnir could not previously do because it was just lightning-based spells, had nothing to do with fizz and all of that. And on top of that, I do have a cast while channeling setup with Purifying Flame and Charge Dash. That's not necessarily something you have to do with your Mjolnir builds when using Wave of Conviction, but I thought it'd be a good opportunity to make use of both of our new physical to fire sort of spells that can trigger and then get scaled off of Chieftain's fire damage and fizz to fire, and just beefiness overall, because this character can easily afford to stand still and channel and take some damage and deal out some damage in return. So you can see a lot of the gameplay once you're at the high end of stuff. This is a level 83 delve. Is still going to be just fine, standing still, getting lots of channeling out, and proccing both Wave of Conviction and your Purifying Flame, and it is a non-crit character, and yet it still deals out huge hits and does plenty of damage. So besides that, the playstyle can easily just be shield charging around, and every time you shield charge, you can see there's a Wave of Conviction proccing, and then only actually using Charge Dash when you really need to throw out an additional spell in the form of Purifying Flame. But the actual Wave of Conviction just off of shield charge will be plenty of damage to actually clear stuff out with. Or altogether, you could just go Cyclone and only proc Wave of Conviction, much more reliably, but it would be somewhat of a different playstyle. I haven't actually tried any other triggers yet. I've only been charge dashing around because I'm kind of a fan of charge dash, and getting out those additional Purifying Flames really isn't bad either. The biggest sort of hurdle to the character was building into a lot of strength and int, and that's the entire divine chest Garb of the Ephemeral's fault. So if you avoid doing that, you can just have a really nice conventional chest, maybe a lore weave, maybe could even go something like a combs. You could go something like a Carcass Jack for more area as well. You can do some pretty cool, funky interactions with Chieftain, Wave of Conviction, and Mjolnir, and just strictly base your character around that and have a very strong, tanky character because of this new interaction. So I do recommend trying that out. This is simply one version of that build, and I will go over what I did and what maybe you could do differently, but the whole purpose was to try and shove a Garb of the Ephemeral in, and it's got a huge strength and a huge int requirement, so it does make my gearing a bit more difficult. Now you can see this is a tier 11 Elder at this point. My first red Elder on this character, first real piece of endgame content in general, and the DPS is respectable. It's nothing too mind-blowing, but I haven't really done too much to gain mind-blowing DPS. It's a pretty budget character, it is pretty tanky, and overall, yeah, it's got respectable DPS. You can see here I am Divine, and it does get basically wasted in its entirety during these slow phases, so that's just the chest being somewhat disappointing in its own right. Once again, I'll go Divine right here for a few seconds and just barely sneak in a bit of damage against Elder, and then Undivine as is the chest's specialty. So I want to go over the character, show you what the gear's like, and especially the new chest. So here we are now at level 88 on SSJ Beeftain, and the entire character is based around the Mjolnir interacting with Wave of Conviction. So as I said, Wave of Conviction is a skill that has entirely, to begin with, all physical damage. A bunch of it is then converted to fire, a bunch is also converted to lightning, and the rest is up to you. And in this version we convert the other 50% to fire, so it is a very largely, as you can see over here, fire-based skill and damage at the moment. Almost entirely fire. There's like maybe 10% lightning, something like that. And then I've also jammed Purifying Flame in too, which does a huge amount of fire as well. Now, every single time you hit with Mjolnir, you will be triggering a Wave of Conviction, and that is based off of a small internal cooldown of 0.15, I believe. Yep, still 0.15. So you can get quite a few of them out very quickly, but you won't be getting as many or as reliable out with something like Charge Dash and Shield Charge. For the most part though, it does one-shot things. I've then done the setup of Charge Dash, Cast while channeling, and Purifying Flame. Because it hits very hard, it drops some Consecrated Ground for regen, and seems to synergize nicely with this entire setup. So that's currently what that looks like, and it is a bit weird and does take a bit of getting used to, because the Cast while channel is actually going to explode wherever your cursor is, but you've also got to control your cursor with Charge Dash itself. And it can get a little tricky because once you've finished charging up your Charge Dash, it's going to stay put at a certain location, and so is your Purifying Flame wherever you end up with your cursor. So it does take a bit of getting used to, but you could just like try and keep it near your character because that's where you want to explode a lot of the time, or in a certain location because that's where you're going to want to target a boss or an enemy. So it does take a little bit of getting used to, and it's not going to be for everyone, I'm sure, but you can easily just base the entire character around Wave of Conviction, Mjolnir, something like Cyclone, maybe Static Strike, and then get things going that way too. But I wanted to synergize both of them together, and it seems to be working pretty fine so far. Now to talk about the chest a little bit, you can see it has a 600 strength and a 750 in requirement, so it definitely isn't easy to build into. You have to go pretty far out of your way to get heavy int or strength on most of your character's gear. So I've got quite a lot of strength and int across the board, but nothing too serious. The only real serious piece of gear is this amulet, which has percent attributes, a lot of all attributes, but the most important thing being 14% reduced attribute requirement. So it makes so the chest only needs something like 500 strength and something like 640 int, which is why I've only got this much and can still wear it. But it's not a super expensive item, not a super hard to get item. There just won't be that many of them out there, and they're not really used for much except for something like this. So the entire point though of the chest is you will be attacking things, and you can get 1 divine charge per hit per second. So it's got a 1 second cooldown on getting a divine charge. So it's going to take you at a minimum of non-stop hitting, let's say one enemy, 10 seconds to get up divinity. Once divinity is up, you cannot gain divine charges for 10 seconds for the duration of having divinity. So you will have a 10-second buff, and once the buff is down, you can then start getting divine charges again to build towards your next divinity. So in a perfectly best case scenario of attacking something non-stop and getting the procs off consistently, it will be up half the time. Now, you don't really get to pick when those moments are because you just kind of will be attacking things and eventually it's going to proc. And it's a pretty big buff. It's very good. It does, I think, 50% more elemental damage, so it's a really large damage multiplier, 20% less elemental damage taken, immune to curses, and also increases the character size by 20%. And it's also pretty obvious because you'll see during the clips, you'd get a lot bigger and go very golden and kind of Super Saiyan-like. So it's a really nice buff, but the problem is any buff that's up like half the time, and especially kind of randomly, is barely worth using or building around. And besides that, the chest does barely anything. Nearby enemies cannot deal crit strikes. That's pretty nice. It does mean things will be hitting you just a little less hard, a little more consistently. So it does add to a bit of tankiness there. But overall, I really cannot condone the use of this chest because it took so much strength, so much int, and gear fuckery to actually put it together and work. And ultimately, I get a buff half the time that you could probably get similar sorts of damage and life from just building without it. So if I didn't have to go into all this weird gearing for like strength, int, and just, you know, pure stats, I could get probably a lot more damage elsewhere. Like an amulet could have an extra 20% extra physical as fire from an elder base, and that by itself makes up a lot of damage already. And if I wasn't wearing this chest, I'm sure I could quite easily pull out like 7k, 7.5k life all of a sudden and get a bit more damage elsewhere. So it just seems a bit weird. It's just, for an endgame chest from the endgame boss, which drops off a cortex, it's pretty inconsistent, pretty hard to build around, and overall not that worth it. But hey, by all means, if you want to do it, get into it. The idea for me to build around this chest was basically to have a character that is strong enough that it doesn't need the chest up all of the time, so that when the chest is up, it's just pure bonus of having better damage. So that's currently my idea of how you're supposed to build around it, because you can't really build around a buff that's going to be up half the time, can you? So you just have to hope that you are good enough without it, and then you're even better with it. So I'm using a 5-link throughout most of the video. I only just 6-linked it recently and chucked in Energy Leech, but the primary 5-link here is Charge Dash, Castle Channeling, Added Fire, Purifying Flame, and Combustion. And then in my Wave of Conviction, I'm running Energy Leech and Ellie Focus. I've got up here Arcane Surge, Cast and Damage Taken, Immortal Call, and Blood Rage. Now the Blood Rage and the Arcane Surge are just going to be there to pop your Arcane Surge whenever you hit Blood Rage. It's got nothing to do with the Cast and Damage Taken, but you do want to run the Immortal Call otherwise to help trigger this over here, so that whenever you have Blood Rage and then you get a big hit taken to you, you will gain a 50% increased recovery rate of life. So that gives you a bunch extra regen from our character, as well as better leech. And then over here, I've got my Flame Totem, which just a little bit of extra damage because I've got no spare links to fully beef him up. Then got Herald of Ash, Anger, and Summon Stone Golem. So we are getting a bunch more damage out of this ring for our Herald of Ash. It's not necessarily something you have to do, but it does give strength and int. If you get a better ring than this one, you can get one with 100% buff effect and then 60% fire damage. That is easily best in slot, while this one, it's just good and it's not like you have to do it. Aside from that, Cyclopean Core gives you a bit of extra damage, bunch of stats, not anything too crazy, and then I just had to build into strength and int wherever else I could. You can get a much better shield, but this one's just a bunch of int, so why the hell not? And then over here we have Curse on Hit, Stormbrand, Flammability, and Ellie Weakness. So I only really ever do that for hard targets and single target boss fights. Just drop a Stormbrand and that curses things and also helps keep up your elemental overload over here. So it's built pretty similarly to my original Beeftain. That is a Blade Vortex Chieftain character, but it is based around Mjolnir, and I had to rework a little bit of gear and stuff to get this sort of int and strength requirement. If you take this item out of the equation, you're looking at a character that's going to cost like fucking 20C to put together, because a Mjolnir was 4 chaos, and then every other piece of gear is just a joke beside that. It's really nothing too special at all, unless you really need to get one of these, which helps, but it's by no means carrying the build. And that's a Watcher's Eye with 20% of extra fizz as fire. This ran 50C when I first put it together, or bought it, and it's just a bit of extra min-max for this type of character. So what we're running with is a pretty basic passive tree, similar to the way the Blade Vortex character worked, and that is just bunch of life, bunch of fire damage, the minion nodes for extra damage as well, getting some of these conversion, which don't really matter at all because we're already fully converted, just extra damage though otherwise, still working into that one, a little bit of area, bit of attack speed and accuracy, and then a second curse and a bunch of fire damage, a bunch of flask nodes. It's a pretty basic passive tree, I think. You want to get elemental overload fairly early on for something like this, and otherwise just a bunch of life throughout the tree. There's really nothing too complicated here. You don't have to go any one way to begin with. You just get life, get damage as you see fit, and run around with Wave of Conviction to level with, or Purifying Flame, whichever feels better. With a strong leveling setup, it's very good to level with. The skills themselves just carry the leveling experience, and as soon as you can get Mjolnir on, that's when things start to go really nicely. So that's probably all I need to say for the character for his introduction for now. Hopefully I'll have a bit more endgame content for him in the next day or two. I'm going to try and take on Uber Elder and stuff like that. You could maybe even do a Blade Vortex with a Castle channel here instead, and then still have a similar sort of setup to Beeftain, but just a bit different of a gameplay. But yeah, it's a pretty strong character so far. I'd say it's pretty close to taking title of Beeftain 2.0. I definitely need to see it in the end game, but Wave of Conviction with Mjolnir is a very strong interaction. The chest itself kind of garbage, so it is kind of garbage of the Ephemeral, but I think I've somewhat found a use for it. Probably one of the best ones you could come out there with a use for this thing, because it's just a little bit too wonky to actually build around. So this is my sort of version of a Beeftain with a Mjolnir, but just want to get you guys thinking about Wave of Conviction Mjolnir yourselves. You can put it in plenty of other sorts of setups. It doesn't have to be this one, or you can build around it in this one with something like Cyclone instead. It's pretty strong interaction and definitely a lot of fun too. So for now guys, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.